My phone buzzed at 8:14 on a Saturday night. Fraud alert. Then, 30 seconds later, an actual call, a number I didn't recognize with a bank's name attached to the caller ID. I almost let it go to voicemail. I remember that specifically, because Saturday nights had become, over the past year, the nights I mostly spent alone, and an unfamiliar number rarely meant anything good. Something made me pick up anyway, some instinct I hadn't learned to name yet. I answered it sitting alone on my couch, the TV muted, a bowl of cereal I was eating for dinner going soft in my hand. Behind the voice on the line, I could hear it before the agent even finished her first sentence. A DJ. Glasses clinking. Somebody, far off, yelling speech, 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 the way people do at a reception once the toasts start running long. The agent's name was Denise, and she explained, calm and professional, that she was calling to verify a series of recent charges flagged as unusual on an account associated with my social security number. She read off a merchant name I didn't recognize, a dollar amount that made my stomach drop, and then, almost as an afterthought, mentioned that the number she'd initially tried belonged to a different contact listed on the account, someone who hadn't been reachable, which was why the system had escalated to my number as the primary account holder. I wasn't at that reception. I hadn't been invited to it. I sat very still on my couch, phone pressed to my ear, and said the only sentence that actually mattered in that moment. I wasn't even invited. If you're new here, this is Calm Verdict. Quiet Power. Final Reverse. On the record. This is the story of a family that used my name, my social security number, and my carefully protected credit file to open nearly 6 figures of debt I never once signed for. It's the story of a wedding reception I wasn't invited to, and a fraud alert that reached them anyway, mid-toast, mid-dance, mid-celebration of a life they'd built partly on paper with my identity attached to it. I didn't crash that reception. I never once walked through those doors. I made the bank find them there instead. By the time the cake was cut, cards were declining at the bar. By the time the last guest went home, my identity was frozen at all 3 bureaus, an official fraud report existed with my name correctly spelled on it for once, and the family who'd decided I couldn't be bothered to attend had a much bigger problem than an empty seat at table 9. I want to walk you through every part of how it got to that point, because the phone call on my couch is only the payoff. The real story is everything that happened quietly, over years, before anyone in my family ever thought a spreadsheet and a stack of certified letters could actually reach them at their own reception. My name is Maya Ellison. I'm 38. I work in office administration, the kind of job that never makes anyone's holiday toast but keeps entire departments from quietly falling apart. I've spent 16 years building one thing on purpose, one thing nobody in my family ever had to help me build, a credit file so clean you could eat off it. I started that discipline at 22, fresh out of a community college program, working a front desk job that paid barely enough to cover rent on a studio apartment I shared with a roommate I barely knew. I made a decision early, watching a coworker struggle under collections calls at her desk one afternoon, that I would never let my own name become a liability for anyone, myself included. I paid every bill on the day it arrived, not the day it was due. I kept my utilization under 10% even when it meant saying no to things I wanted. Nobody taught me any of that. I taught myself, out of a library book and a lot of trial and error. My current manager, years later, still occasionally jokes that I could run the finance department better than the finance department does, mostly because I'm the person who catches a billing discrepancy before it becomes a real problem, the person who reads a contract's fine print for fun on a lunch break. That instinct, the one that made me genuinely good at my job, is the exact same instinct that eventually let me catch my own family before their fraud had time to fully bury me. In my family, that cleanliness never got called what it actually was, which was years of discipline, on-time payments, a utilization ratio I tracked the way other people track their step count. It got called something smaller. Maya's fine. Maya's got it together. Maya's the reliable one. My sister Tessa got praised for her taste, her parties, the way a room felt different once she walked into it. My mother, Patricia, praised my credit score the exact way other families praise a trust fund, approvingly, from a comfortable distance, without ever once asking how it got built or what it had cost me to maintain. My father mostly stayed out of these conversations entirely, the way he stayed out of most conversations that required taking a side. He'd occasionally tell me, quietly, on the rare afternoons we spoke without anyone else around, that he was proud of how I'd built my life. He never once said it in front of Mom or Tessa. I used to wonder why. Eventually I stopped wondering and just accepted it as one more small, disappointing fact about the shape of that family. I didn't mind being reliable, not at first. I liked being the one people could count on. I just didn't understand, for longer than I'd like to admit, that in my family, being counted on and being used were eventually going to become the same sentence. I remember a specific Thanksgiving, maybe 5 years back, when Mom introduced me to a family friend visiting from out of town. "This is Maya, my responsible one," she said, warmly, the way you'd introduce a prized possession. The friend asked what that meant, exactly, and Mom laughed and said, "Oh, she's just good with money. Always has been." Nobody in that conversation asked how I'd gotten good with money, what I'd given up to build a savings cushion by 26, or why good with money had somehow become my entire personality in that family's eyes rather than one small fact about me among many others. Looking back, I think that Thanksgiving is where I should have started asking harder questions. A daughter introduced primarily by her credit habits, at a holiday dinner, to a stranger, isn't being celebrated. She's being appraised, quietly, for future use, the way you'd note the load rating on a bridge before deciding how much weight to eventually put on it. Here's how it actually starts, in case you've never lived through the slow version of this particular betrayal. First it's a grocery run, Mom's card declining at the register, and me handing mine over without a second thought, because what kind of daughter makes her mother stand there embarrassed in a checkout line? Then it's an emergency dental bill for Tessa, $600, we'll pay you back Friday, a Friday that arrived and left without a single dollar moving in my direction. Then, slowly, without anyone ever sitting me down to discuss it, I became an authorized user on accounts I'd never agreed to be attached to, my name quietly added the way you'd add a spare key to a lockbox nobody bothered mentioning existed. Mom's voice, more than once, on the subject of why it was always me, "You're the only one they approve, honey. It just makes sense." As if my discipline was a shared community resource rather than something I'd built alone. On nights I didn't go out, on years I drove a car 2 payments longer than I wanted to. There was one specific summer I still think about, when Tessa needed a security deposit for a new apartment, and instead of asking me directly, Mom simply told the landlord I'd be a guarantor, then called me afterward to confirm I was fine with it, as though the confirmation call was a formality rather than the entire conversation that should have happened first. I said yes anyway, because saying no at that point would have felt like breaking a habit nobody had ever formally established but everyone had quietly come to expect. Another time, closer to 2 years ago, I found out I'd been listed as an emergency contact on a lease application for Greg, a document that also, buried in a section I hadn't looked at closely, listed my income alongside his as part of a combined household presentation to the landlord, despite the fact that we had never once lived together, or even discussed the possibility. There was also the time Mom asked if she could borrow my good name for a furniture store's zero-interest promotion, phrased so casually over dinner that I almost missed how strange the sentence actually was until I replayed it in my head hours later. Your good name. As if my credit history was a nice dress hanging in my closet, available for anyone in the family to slip into for a special occasion and return, presumably unstained, whenever they were finished with it. I have a drawer full of unpaid Venmo requests from that stretch, little digital IOUs that never once got honored, sitting there like fossils of every time just this once turned out to be a pattern nobody in that family intended to break. The wedding website went live on a Tuesday. Tessa's fiancé built it himself, apparently, all soft fonts in a photo gallery and an RSVP page that scrolled through everyone who mattered. I found it because a cousin sent me the link, assuming, reasonably, that I'd already seen it. My name wasn't on the guest list. Not missing by accident, not a glitch in some spreadsheet, deliberately absent, the way a name gets left off a list by someone who sat there and decided, specifically, that it should be. It wasn't the first quiet exclusion that year, I realized, once I actually started looking back. There'd been a bridal shower 3 months earlier that I'd only heard about after the fact, through a photo someone posted. Women I recognized from Tessa's side gathered around a table with a banner and a cake, an event I'd apparently never been considered for despite having been the one who quietly covered the caterer's deposit when Tessa's card had some kind of processing issue the week before. I scrolled through the rest of the site that night anyway, unable to stop myself, the way you can't stop pressing on a bruise once you've found it. There was a full page dedicated to the wedding party, another to a registry stocked with items that added up to more money than I made in 2 months combined, and our story section that mentioned, warmly, how supportive the whole family had been throughout their engagement. Supportive. I read that word twice, thinking about $600 in dental bills nobody had ever mentioned repaying. I found an old photo folder on my own laptop that same night, almost by accident, family gatherings from years back, birthdays, a Christmas where I'm laughing at something just out of frame. I sat with those photos for longer than I meant to, trying to pinpoint the exact moment things had shifted from a family that occasionally leaned on me to a family that had apparently started planning around me being useful rather than present. I never did find one clean moment. It had happened gradually, the way most erosion does, a little at a time, until one day the shoreline simply looks different than it used to. That same cousin texted me an hour later, careful, clearly fishing. Did you decline? People are saying you couldn't be bothered to come. Couldn't be bothered. I read that phrase 3 times, sitting at my kitchen table, trying to reconcile it with the version of myself who'd covered a dental bill, a grocery run, and Lord knows what else over the preceding 2 years without once being asked to RSVP to any of it. I didn't reply to my cousin that night. I opened my laptop instead, and I started pulling my credit report, mostly out of habit, the way you check a smoke detector even when nothing smells like smoke yet. I want to be honest about something. Part of me, sitting there that night, still expected to find nothing wrong. I'd been the reliable one for so long that even after being deliberately erased from a guest list, some old, well-trained part of my brain assumed the problem was probably just a scheduling mix-up, an oversight, anything other than what it actually turned out to be. I've since learned that instinct, the reflex to assume the best about people who've already shown you otherwise, is usually the last thing standing between a person and the truth they've been avoiding. The mail had actually been trying to tell me something for weeks before I sat down and finally listened to it. A coworker, of all people, had mentioned it first, casually, weeks earlier, noticing me toss another pre-approval envelope straight into the shred bin at the office without opening it. "You get a lot of those," she said, not thinking much of it. I told her it was normal, that everyone with decent credit gets flooded with them. It wasn't until much later that I realized how many of those normal envelopes I'd been shredding unread, unknowingly destroying evidence of exactly the thing that was already happening to me. Pre-approval offers, more of them than usual, the kind of thing you shred without reading because you assume your file is too clean to be interesting to anyone. A credit card, physical, embossed, sitting in my mailbox one Thursday, that I had absolutely no memory of ordering. A statement, addressed correctly to my apartment, listing charges from a city I hadn't set foot in for over a year. I actually laughed the first time I saw that statement, a short, disbelieving sound, because for half a second my brain tried to file it under identity theft by a stranger, some anonymous criminal 3 states away, which would have almost been easier to accept than the alternative I hadn't let myself consider yet. Strangers steal identities for profit. Families, I would learn over the following weeks, apparently do it for convenience. I sat at my kitchen table with that stack of envelopes lined up in front of me like evidence, because that's exactly what it was. I opened each one slowly, methodically, the way you'd open a chart you already suspected was going to show something you didn't want to see. I remember calling the number on the back of that embossed card first, half expecting a customer service rep to tell me it was some kind of promotional mistake, a marketing card mailed to the wrong address entirely. Instead, the automated system read back an account number that was, unmistakably, already active, already carrying a balance, already 3 months old by the time I ever laid eyes on the physical card itself. By the third envelope, my hands had gone cold in a way that had nothing to do with the apartment's temperature. I want to walk you through this carefully, because it matters that you understand this wasn't one bad dinner charge or one moment of poor judgment at a register. This was a stack, layered over time, deliberately. A secret credit card, opened 18 months earlier, statements quietly redirected somewhere I'd never lived. A personal loan, framed to whoever signed for it as a bridge, 5 figures, sitting entirely under my name on the paperwork I eventually pulled, the loan officer's notes, when I finally got a copy, described the borrower as self-employed with steady income, neither of which has ever once applied to me. 2 store cards I'd never once shopped at, both maxed within weeks of opening, one of them for a furniture chain I couldn't have named if you'd asked me before that week. Phone and utility accounts, running for over a year under my identity, paid inconsistently enough that collection notices had started quietly stacking up somewhere I'd never see them, at an address that, as far as I could tell, belonged to nobody in my actual family. And underneath all of it, the piece that actually stopped my breathing for a moment at that kitchen table, my social security number, used on a credit application I had never seen, never signed, never once been told about, the application itself listing an income figure roughly double what I actually made. I remember pulling up each account's opening date and lining them up chronologically on a single page, watching a clear pattern emerge that no single conversation with my family had ever hinted at. The secret card came first, 18 months back, quiet and small. Then the store cards, for months later, once the first card had apparently proven the strategy worked. Then the personal loan, the biggest single piece, opened almost exactly 1 year before the wedding date I'd since learned about from a website instead of an invitation. It wasn't chaos. It was a plan, executed patiently, the way you'd execute any plan you didn't expect anyone to ever actually notice. Running total, once I've finally added every single trade line together, sat close to $180,000 in exposure. Not spent by me. Not authorized by me. Owed, on paper, in my name, by a system that had no idea any of it was fraud yet. I didn't cry over that spreadsheet. I highlighted it instead, line by line, the way I'd highlight any discrepancy I needed to actually fix. I called that furniture chain, out of curiosity more than anything, just to see what exactly had been purchased on an account I'd never opened. A leather sectional, a dining set, and a crib, delivered 8 months earlier to an address I didn't recognize. I sat with that word for a long moment. A crib. Some small, stubborn part of me had still been holding out hope that this was clumsy financial mismanagement rather than deliberate theft, and a crib delivered on my stolen credit line ended that particular hope for good. I called Mom first, before I called anyone official, because some old, stubborn part of me still wanted this to have an innocent explanation I simply hadn't found yet. I remember rehearsing the call in my head twice before actually dialing, trying to figure out a way to ask about 6 figures of fraudulent debt without it sounding like an accusation, even though it very much was one. In the end, I just read her the numbers, flat, one after another, the way I'd read a discrepancy report to a coworker who needed to hear the facts before the apology. Her first response was soft denial, careful, testing the water. "I don't know what you're talking about, Maya." When I read her 3 exact numbers off 3 exact statements, the denial shifted, fast, into something closer to management. "We were going to tell you. It just hadn't come up yet." I asked when, exactly, it had been going to come up. She didn't have an answer ready for that one. I asked a second question, quieter, the one that actually mattered most to me. Did she know about the Social Security number being used on an application? There was a pause on the line, longer than any of the others, and when she finally answered, her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Greg handled some of the paperwork." I didn't look closely at every form. I asked whether Tessa knew. Another pause. "She knows some of it. It's complicated, Maya. We were always going to make it right once things settled down after the wedding." I asked what settled down was supposed to mean, given that the debt had been accumulating for over a year with no sign of anyone making anything right on their own timeline. She didn't have an answer for that one either. Then came the line that actually told me everything I needed to know about how this was going to go. "Please don't do anything right now. You'll ruin Tessa's week." And right behind it, delivered like a house rule I'd apparently missed my whole life, "Family doesn't call the bank on family." I set the phone face down on my counter after that call ended, and I sat with the silence for a long moment, because I finally understood, completely, that this wasn't a misunderstanding I could talk my way out of. It was a system, built over years, that had simply been waiting for me to notice. The call had lasted 11 minutes. I know because I checked afterward, oddly needing the number the way you need to know the exact time something ended, as if the precision itself could offer some kind of comfort. 11 minutes to confirm that a debt I'd spent 16 years avoiding had quietly been built in my name anyway, by the people who were supposed to have my back the most. I wrote 4 words on a sticky note and put it on my bathroom mirror, where I'd see it every single morning until this was finished. Freeze first. Feelings second. Underneath it, a 5th line, smaller, and no reception speech. I sat with that sticky note for a long moment before I let myself move on to actually planning anything. Writing feelings second on a mirror I look at every morning felt, honestly, a little brutal, even as I wrote it. But I'd already tried feelings first, on the phone with Mom, and feelings first had gotten me a lecture about ruining a party I hadn't even been invited to attend. 5 systems, in order, all of them finished before the wedding weekend they'd already built an entire celebration around, without me. I called a consumer protection attorney the same night I wrote that sticky note, not to file anything yet, just to understand my actual options before I moved a single piece. She listened to the whole timeline without interrupting once, then told me something I've held onto since: the relationship part is yours to decide later. The legal part isn't a family conversation. It's just a fact pattern, and fact patterns don't care whose name is on the birth certificate. That sentence did more to settle my nerves than anything else said to me that entire week. Quick pause here, because if any of this sounds familiar to you, if family treats your credit file like a shared closet, something everyone gets to borrow from without asking, that's not closeness. That's exposure, dressed up as love. Freeze before you debate. Love does not require your social security number, ever, under any circumstance. I'll say one more thing before moving on, because I think it matters. None of what I did next came from a place of wanting to punish anyone for the sake of punishment. Every single move was defensive, procedural, the kind of thing any consumer protection attorney would have told me to do regardless of who the fraud came from. The fact that it happened to be my own mother and sister didn't change a single step of the process. It just made each step harder to actually go through with. Okay. 5 systems, starting now. First move, I froze my file at all 3 credit bureaus, back to back, in under 20 minutes, each confirmation number written down the second it came through. The first bureau's website was, frustratingly, down for maintenance right when I tried it, and I remember sitting there at almost 11 at night, refreshing a loading screen, feeling something close to panic that the one tool I actually had control over might not be available exactly when I needed it most. It came back online 20 minutes later. I've never in my life felt relief over a website loading the way I did that night. I called my bank directly after that and asked for fraud alerts on every single account I actually controlled, plus a formal note on file about the identity theft I now had documentation for. The representative on that call, a woman who introduced herself as Carla, walked me through each step without a single hint of judgment in her voice, which mattered more to me in that moment than I expected it to. At one point she asked, gently, whether the fraud had been committed by someone I knew. I told her yes. She paused, just briefly, and said, "That's actually more common than you'd think," in a tone that told me she'd guided plenty of people through exactly the same conversation before me. There's a specific, quiet relief in watching 3 separate confirmation screens tell you, plainly, that nobody can open another line of credit in your name without your explicit permission anymore. It doesn't undo the damage already sitting on my report. It does stop the bleeding, immediately, completely, the way a tourniquet does before you ever get to a hospital. I saved each confirmation number to a document I titled simply Freeze, printed a copy, and put the printed copy in a folder along with everything else. I've learned, over the years, that digital records feel real right up until the moment your laptop won't turn on, and paper, unglamorous as it is, has never once let me down in a crisis. Next, paperwork, boring and devastating in exactly the way real paperwork always is. I ordered a small stack of manila folders that same week, 1 per creditor, labeled in the same block capitals I use for everything that matters. It felt almost absurd, at first, treating my own family's fraud with the same clinical organization I'd use for a client audit at work. Then I remembered that clinical organization was exactly the skill set I actually had, the one thing in this entire mess that was still fully, reliably mine, and I stopped feeling absurd about it fairly quickly. An identity theft report, filed formally, each fraudulent account listed by name, date, and amount. Affidavits for every creditor involved, notarized, precise. Dispute letters, 1 per trade line, sent certified mail so there'd never be a question later about whether they'd been received. I built the whole packet at my kitchen table over 2 nights, printing, signing, stacking, the same table where I'd once read my own statements and felt my hands go cold. This time my hands were steady. I had a system now, and systems, unlike families, don't require you to explain yourself twice. Each letter followed the same format, almost boringly so: date of discovery, account number, amount, a plain statement that the debt was fraudulent and not mine, a request for investigation and removal. I printed an extra copy of every single one for my own file, 3-hole punched, organized by creditor, because if there's one thing 16 years of office administration teaches you, it's that a well-organized binder wins more arguments than a raised voice ever will. The notary I used, a woman at a small print shop 2 blocks from my apartment, asked, gently, if I was okay, watching me sign document after document with a steadiness that apparently didn't match the circumstances she was reading between the lines of. I told her I was fine, and for the first time in weeks, I actually meant it when I said it. I mailed each dispute letter certified, return receipt requested, so that months later, if any creditor tried to claim they'd never received my documentation, I'd have a signed slip proving otherwise. That small detail, a $2 add-on at the post office counter, ended up mattering more than almost anything else in the entire process, closing off one of the few excuses creditors sometimes use to slow-walk a legitimate dispute. Then, the people, not just the paper. I removed every single family member from every account where I'd ever added them as an authorized user, one login at a time, methodically, the way you'd clear out a spreadsheet full of formulas nobody remembered writing. Anything I still controlled directly, I closed outright. Anything I didn't control, the accounts opened without my knowledge, I documented instead, screenshot by screenshot, building a timeline no future conversation would be able to talk its way around. I found, going through old statements, that Greg had actually been an authorized user on one of my own accounts for almost 2 years, added during a business bridge conversation I barely remembered agreeing to, back when it had seemed like a small, reasonable favor between family. Removing his access took less than a minute. Understanding how long it had quietly existed took considerably longer to sit with. Tessa's name turned up too, on an older card I'd nearly forgotten I still carried, added back when she'd first moved out on her own and needed, she'd said at the time, just a little backup for emergencies. I checked the activity log before closing that access and found exactly one emergency charge, from 3 years earlier, followed by a slow, steady trickle of charges that had never once matched the definition of the word. I went through every single account I had open, one by one, cross-referencing authorized users against a list I built from memory and then double-checked against old emails. It was slow, unglamorous work, the kind nobody films for a highlight reel, and I did every bit of it alone, at my kitchen table, over the course of an entire weekend I'd originally planned to spend doing absolutely nothing. I didn't send a single angry message while I did any of this. I just worked, quietly, the way I've always worked, closing doors that should have never been left open in the first place. Fourth, an official report, filed in person at my local precinct, and a matching report through the FTC's identity theft system. The FTC report, filled out online the night before my precinct visit, walked me through a series of questions I answered as plainly as I could: which accounts, which dates, which amounts, whether I knew the person responsible. That last question sat on my screen for a long moment before I typed yes. There's something particular about typing the word yes in a government form when the person you're identifying is your own mother's household. The form didn't care how that felt. It just needed the answer, which, in hindsight, is exactly the kind of clarity I needed that week. I want to be clear about why, because it wasn't for drama, and it wasn't to threaten anyone. Banks require this specific paper trail before they'll formally reverse fraudulent charges. Without a police report number and an FTC affidavit, disputes can drag on for months with far less leverage behind them. The officer who took my report was patient, unhurried, entirely unbothered by how ordinary my story probably sounded to him. He'd clearly heard versions of it before, family members instead of strangers, which apparently changes very little about how the paperwork actually works. He asked, at one point, whether I wanted to pursue charges. I told him I wasn't sure yet, that right now I just needed the documentation to fix my credit, and he nodded like that was a perfectly reasonable place to land. A lot of people start there, he said. Some move further. Some don't. Either way, you'll have the report. I sat in my car in the precinct parking lot afterward for a few minutes before driving home, turning that decision over in my head. I still hadn't decided, even months later, whether I'd ever actually press charges against my own family. What I knew for certain, sitting there, was that the option now existed on paper, permanently, whether or not I ever used it, and having the option felt different from being at their mercy about whether I ever would. I walked out with a case number. That case number went straight into my growing folder, right next to the freeze confirmations and the certified mail receipts. Last move before the collision I could feel building, one short email, sent to Mom, Tessa, and Greg together. Do not use my identity for any purpose, effective immediately. All fraudulent accounts have been disputed and reported. Do not contact me during this weekend's event to explain anything. If you need to discuss the charges, contact the fraud department directly. Their number is listed on the statements you're already familiar with. No essay attached. No live stream rant posted anywhere. Just the facts, laid out plainly, time-stamped, sent, done. Tessa replied within the hour, a single line, wow. Okay. Good to know where I stand with you 3 days before my wedding. I didn't respond to that either. I'd already learned, over the preceding weeks, that responding to bait dressed up as hurt feelings just kept the conversation alive on their terms instead of mine, and I'd had enough of conversations happening on their terms to last a very long time. I read that email back 3 times before I sent it, cutting sentences that felt too much like an argument, keeping only the ones that read like policy. It's a strange discipline, writing something that furious and making it sound almost administrative. I think that's exactly what made it land as hard as it eventually did. I closed my laptop that night and noticed, almost as an afterthought, one small detail buried in my own statements, a vendor deposit for what looked like a florist, sitting on a card that had my name on the account, quietly funding a piece of a wedding I still hadn't been invited to. Saturday arrived. The reception started at 6. I spent that afternoon doing ordinary things on purpose, grocery shopping, laundry, a long walk I didn't really need but took anyway, because I wanted the day to feel like a day I'd chosen, not a day I was simply enduring while somewhere across town a room filled up with people who'd decided I didn't belong in it. I remember standing in the laundromat around 4, folding a shirt, and thinking, almost calmly, that in a few hours my case would either move or it wouldn't, and either way I'd already done everything within my power to make sure it moved eventually. My cousin, the one who'd texted me weeks earlier, ended up posting stories throughout the evening, mostly out of habit, I think, not realizing what she was actually documenting for me from the outside. A friend from work texted around 7, unprompted, just checking in, no idea what night this actually was for me. I told her the truth, briefly, and she offered to come over. I told her I was okay on my own, which was true, though I appreciated the offer more than I let on in the text. Not every hard night needs company. Some of them just need someone to know it's happening, somewhere, quietly, in the background of an ordinary week. I sat at my own kitchen table that night, the same table where all of this had started, laptop open, 2 tabs running side by side. One showed the bank's fraud case portal, refreshing every so often for updates. The other, despite myself, showed my cousin's story feed, chandelier lighting, a slow dance, my mother laughing at something just out of frame. I noticed, in one of the photos, a floral arrangement I recognized from the vendor statement I'd found buried in my own account activity days earlier. It was strange, watching flowers I'd unknowingly paid for glow warmly in the background of a celebration I wasn't allowed to attend. I didn't feel rage looking at it, exactly. I felt something closer to confirmation, the specific, quiet feeling of watching a suspicion finally become a fact. I didn't watch those stories out of jealousy. I watched them with my bank's fraud line open in another tab, timestamps lined up side by side, waiting to see exactly when the 2 timelines would finally intersect. It happened around 8:30. The fraud department, working through the case I'd opened days earlier, reached out to the phone number listed on one of the fraudulent applications, Greg's number, as it turned out, the same number he'd apparently used without asking when the account got opened. I imagine, though I never got the full details, that the call went something like every fraud verification call goes, a series of careful questions about recent activity, about whether certain charges were authorized, questions that would have been impossible to answer honestly without immediately revealing that none of it had ever been his to authorize in the first place. Greg, I should mention, had always positioned himself as the practical one in that side of the family, the guy with a head for numbers, the one who'd apparently handled some of the paperwork, in Mom's words, for more of these accounts than I initially realized. I found out later, through documents I requested during the dispute process, that his signature appeared, forged or otherwise, on at least 2 of the applications tied to my name. I'm still not entirely sure which of those two words applies. The paperwork, thankfully, doesn't require me to sort that out. It only requires proof that the accounts weren't mine, and that proof existed in abundance. At almost the same moment, according to what I pieced together afterward, a card tied to the same trade line declined at the bar. Then again, at the florist's final balance, the same vendor account I'd noticed the night before. I wasn't in that room. I never once needed to be. The systems I'd already put in motion were doing the only kind of confrontation I actually believed in, quiet, procedural, and completely undeniable once it started. I pieced most of this timeline together afterward, partly from my cousin's stories, partly from the bank's own call log once I requested it weeks later, partly from the panicked messages that started flooding my phone almost immediately. The bank's outreach call happened at 8:22. The first fraud message from Mom landed at 8:41. 19 minutes, start to finish, for an entire evening to shift from celebration to crisis, a timeline that felt, reading it back later, almost absurdly short for something that had taken over a year to build. My phone started lighting up around 9. Mom first, voice climbing before I'd even finished saying hello. Fix this right now, Maya. Guests are watching. Do you have any idea how this looks? I answered the way I'd been planning to answer for days. I filed a case number 3 days ago. It's on the paperwork I emailed you. Speak to the fraud department directly. I'm not the office that handles this anymore. She tried once more, softer, sharper, both at the same time somehow. You're really going to let this ruin her night? I didn't ruin anything, I said. I stopped funding it. Those are different sentences, and I think you already know that. Tessa texted separately, a few minutes later, 3 words with no punctuation. How could you? I didn't answer that one at all. Some questions aren't actually questions, they're just accusations wearing a question mark, and I've learned it's not my job to argue with the costume. Greg called twice, back to back, and left one voicemail I listened only once. His voice had none of its usual confidence in it, fast and defensive, insisting the accounts were always going to get sorted out eventually and that I was making a whole thing out of normal family stuff. I saved the voicemail without responding to it. Normal family stuff, in my experience, doesn't usually require a police report number to sort itself out. My father texted just once, close to midnight, after most of the noise had died down. Are you okay? 2 words, no explanation of what he'd seen or heard that night, no defense of anyone. I told him I was fine, and for once, that felt like the full truth rather than a placeholder for a bigger conversation I didn't have energy for. I gave no speech. I sent no rescue payment. I hung up, set the phone face down, and finished the tea that had gone lukewarm on my counter while all of it unfolded 3 towns away, entirely without me. The family group chat did exactly what these chats always do. A villain edit of me circulated within the hour. She ruined the wedding, she humiliated us in front of everyone, she couldn't even wait 1 weekend. I saved every message, screenshotted, time-stamped, filed next to everything else. A few relatives, quietly, privately, reached out with a different version. One aunt messaged simply, I always wondered how they afforded all that. Now I know. I'm sorry, Maya. I didn't need the validation, not really, but I won't pretend it didn't land somewhere soft in me anyway, after weeks of being cast as the villain in a story I hadn't written. I told my manager a stripped-down version of what had happened, mostly to explain why I'd been distracted at work for a few weeks running. She didn't pry for details. She just adjusted a few of my deadlines without making a production out of it and told me, on my way out one Friday, that she'd dealt with something similar herself years earlier, a sibling this time instead of a parent. It gets quieter, she said. Not immediately. But it does. I've thought about that sentence more than once since. I kept working the disputes over the following weeks, patient, methodical, watching fraudulent lines get investigated and slowly, one at a time, removed from my report. My score dropped initially, the way it does when fraud gets discovered before it gets corrected. It started climbing back within 2 months, the honest, unglamorous way credit always rebuilds, slowly, on paper, with time as the only real ingredient that actually works. By the time 6 months had passed, every fraudulent trade line had either been removed outright or was clearly marked as disputed and under investigation, no longer counting against me in any meaningful way. The personal loan took the longest, requiring 3 separate rounds of documentation before the lender finally agreed it had never actually been mine to repay. I remember opening that final resolution letter and reading it twice, just to be sure I wasn't imagining the sentence that finally closed the file for good. I agreed to exactly 1 phone call with Mom, weeks later, once the worst of the disputes had settled. She opened the call quieter than I expected, none of the volume from the reception night left in her voice. "I've been thinking about what you said. About family and credit lines getting confused." I let her sit with that thought for a moment instead of filling the silence for her, a habit I'd spent years unlearning specifically for conversations like this one. Relationship, I told her, was still possible, going forward, on different terms than before. Authorized user culture in this family was finished, permanently, no exceptions made for weddings, emergencies, or anyone's version of just this once. Any future request for help would go through a written loan agreement, signed by both parties, or it simply wouldn't happen at all. She asked, quietly, near the end of that call, whether I still considered myself part of the family after everything. I told her the truth. I never stopped being your daughter. I stopped being your credit line. Those got confused for a long time, and I'm not confusing them again. She didn't argue with the terms. I think, by that point, even she understood there wasn't much room left to argue from. Tessa reached out separately, months later, once she and Greg were back from the honeymoon and, I assume, back to reality about the size of the mess waiting for them. Her message was short, none of the earlier fury left in it. I didn't know it was that bad until the bank started calling us too. "I'm sorry we let it get to you." I appreciated the honesty more than I expected to. I told her the same thing I'd told Mom, relationship possible, terms non-negotiable, no exceptions for family emergencies dressed up as favors ever again. Here's the verdict. Being uninvited to a family celebration is cruel, plain and simple, and it stings exactly as much as it sounds like it would. But using someone's identity without their knowledge isn't a family matter at all. It's criminal adjacent, and it deserves to be treated like the paper trail it actually is, not like a mood that will eventually pass on its own. If you've ever been the reliable one in your own family, the one whose stability quietly became a resource other people budgeted around without ever asking, I want you to hear this clearly. Being trustworthy is not the same thing as being available for anything, indefinitely, without consent. A clean credit file is a tool you build for your own future, not a shared family asset simply because you happen to be the one disciplined enough to build it first. They didn't save me a seat that night. They saved me a balance instead, in my name, without my permission, and somehow expected gratitude for the omission. I still work in office administration. I still keep my utilization low, still pay every bill the day it arrives instead of the day it's due, because that discipline was never actually about impressing anyone in my family, it was about protecting the one thing that was fully, undeniably mine. These days, though, nobody's name gets added to my accounts without a conversation first, a real one, with actual terms, written down where memory can't quietly edit them later. You can uninvite a daughter from a reception. You cannot uninvite a fraud department once she's already made the call. I think about that night on my couch sometimes, cereal going soft in my hand, a bank's voice telling me about a party I hadn't been trusted enough to attend but had apparently been trusted enough to finance without ever being asked. I don't think about it with anger anymore, most days. I think about it the way you'd check an old scar, just confirming it healed the way it was supposed to. If this sat somewhere in your chest tonight, you're in the right place. This is Calm Verdict. Quiet Power. Final Justice. On the record. Subscribe if you want more stories that settle the score without ever needing to scream. And tell me, in one word, were you uninvited, or did you hit freeze? I read every one. I'll see you in the next one.